one.
Good afternoon. We're here to talk a little bit about how blended learning practices align with the Nevada Educator Performance Framework. And today is part one of a 5-part series. And so my name is Brian Lentz. I'm a coordinator in the Online and Blended Learning Department in Clark County School Districts. And with me today is Tammy.
Tambry Tondrick. I'm the Executive Director of Operations from Beacon Academy. Thanks for joining.
All right, so when we first start talking about how blended learning aligns with the NEPF, we wanted to kind of define how we're breaking down blended learning. Just as like the Nevada Educator Performance Framework is broken down into standards and indicators, we talked about what are the 5 domains or 5 principles of overarching ideas that blended learning should have in a classroom. And so each of these 5 in the 5-part series is going to be one of these domains. And today we're going to focus on assessment and data. And the work that we're pulling from comes from the National Standards of Quality Online from Quality Matters, and also some of the work that the LS Independent School District put together as well. So when we first look at this domain, the first thing that we're looking at, and really one of the foundation things of blended learning, is making sure that you're using data to drive instruction. And then inside this domain and strand, there's different levels that the teacher could be measured at. So whether it's you're just a beginning teacher, you're starting to develop this skill, you're practicing it, or you're high level achieving. And so looking at the differences of it, in the beginning, teachers may just be using a single source to drive that instruction. Maybe it is a single test that they gave at the beginning of the year, and that's how they group the kids, and they just continue to teach from that first assessment that they give in August. As they start moving up those levels and becoming more adept at using data to drive their instruction, they'll start working in more sources. So maybe the second, they take the MAPS test and they're using something like that to reform the groups. And then the distinction from those bottom tiers to the top 2 tiers is not only is there multiple sources, but we're also using non-academic sources. So something like an interest survey would be a huge thing to use, like to make sure that we're actually trying to make some real world connections to something that these kids are going to be engaged with. And then the difference between practicing and achieving is they're doing it some of the times versus all of the times. And then you notice down at the bottom, what we've written down here is the instructional practices, how this aligns to the NAPF. Each one of these is a standard and an indicator. So looking at 1.1, that would be standard 1, indicator 1, which is new learning is connected to prior learning experience, and that the teacher activates all of the students' initial understandings and concepts and skills.
Hi, Brian, just give me a moment. I have somebody chatting that they want to join our presentation, so I am just sharing the link with them.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the questions that you may ask yourself as an administrator who's going to do an observation is, what should I see when I walk into a blended learning classroom? Because it is very different. You're not going to see a full lesson plan from start to finish. And so some interesting, some thoughts when you start thinking about, the data driven instruction is what systems are in place to share data with students. So what would you look for on this? And the systems may be taking place in the lessons. Are there frequent checks for understanding in the online content itself? And this lets them know that the students are understanding the content, or they understand what's the purpose. Why am I reading this information? Why am I watching this video? And so having those frequent checks for understanding work really well. Another question that you may ask yourself, and I'm not going to go through all 10 of these, I'm just going to highlight a few, but when you're observing and you're wondering, are the teachers setting high expectations and goals for each individual student? What do you expect to see? With an experienced teacher, you may see students working on different lessons, different projects. And so it is unique in that one student may be on lesson 3 and another student may be on lesson 5. Or maybe you're looking at the students doing the same assignment, but one student is creating a PowerPoint presentation while another one is creating a video. And so when you're looking at different, when you're observing, you're not always going to see the whole class doing the exact same thing. What we see in a blended learning program in our school is a lot of motivational coaching. So the teachers are working with individual students because the students are on so many different levels and different places in the class that it's small group instruction or oftentimes individually done. So setting goals with the student, here's what you're going to complete today, things like that. And then another question you may ask are, how are the teachers using the data to inform their instructional decisions? And so what you would look for in this situation is possibly somebody reteaching a concept, providing remediation. Is the grouping done by levels? Are they working on similar projects? And so when you're looking at that data to inform instruction, how is the teacher using that information? A math teacher, for example, may decide, may give an assignment the day before, and then after the class ends, regroup the students so that they, when they're showing up the very next day, the students are regrouped because some of the students didn't do well on question 3. Another group may have gotten, 90% and is moving on. And so just looking at different ways that they can use the data. And those are just a few examples of what you may observe in a blended learning classroom.
Awesome. And so then let's take a look at a little bit deeper in how we can distinguish between the different levels. And so what we've done is we've broken it down into 2 levels and saying beginning and developing can be lumped into one group because they're very, very similar with a few minor distinctions. And then we look at practicing and achieving at the higher end of the spectrum of practicing strong blended learning practices. And so when we look at data-driven instruction, not only do we want to ask how is it being used, but we also want to make sure that students are involved as well. One of the core tenets of blended learning is we really want to transfer that ownership of learning, right? That it's student driven and students owning their own learning. And one of the cornerstones of having that happen is them being in charge of their data, or at least knowing what their data is and why the teachers are making the instructional decisions for them individually. And so that's what we're going to be looking at when we start looking at these different levels. And so if you're just beginning out, there may be very limited evidence that any data is being used to drive instruction. It's, no, this is what the standard is, and this is the activity that I like doing, and this is why I did it, right? Those would be the responses that would send some red flags up. And then also during the observations, talking to the students, asking questions. Now, there's a catch with that, right? We don't want to just take everything what the students say, but maybe what that does is it elicits some other questions that we can ask the teacher when we have our follow-up conference. If the students aren't able to answer it, or they don't answer it exactly what we're looking for, follow up with the teacher, say, hey, if a student was to say this, what would you do to intervene with that student, and try to get what the purpose was for that activity, and try to lead the teacher to to maybe understanding that, oh, you know what, I didn't use data the way that I should have with this lesson. And then as we move on, then what it looks like at the higher levels, there's multiple sources of data and it's being constantly refreshed. So it's not just one touch point at the beginning of the year or the beginning of the unit and never looked at again or gathered again. There should be multiple times throughout the unit that we're trying to gather that data and using those decisions to drive the instructional decisions for the next day's lesson or the next follow-up activities as well. And then when giving the instructions, the teachers should be able to provide the rationale for why they chose that decision based on the data. And it should happen on a regular basis, not only from academic, but non-academic sources. So we mentioned earlier, student interest forms. Another one are like career pathway surveys. Some of those assessments that they take, those can be incorporated as well into some of the data that the teacher's using, trying to make as many connections to the students that are in front of them as possible. One of the examples I always talk about is I thought I was really cool talking about skateboarding, but that maybe hit 3 of the 40 kids I had. So when I started doing small groups and all of a sudden I got 4 softball players in front of me, skateboarding is not really going to be a real world connection for them. But I know softball is. So if I can somehow make the content connect to softball, it's going to mean more to them, right? So that data is important. And just having those informal conversations of, hey, what are your interests? What are you into? Let me know more about what the students are so I could make it a little bit more engaging for the students. And then not only do we want the students involved, we want to make sure that they have access to the data, both summative and formative, whether it's through a digital platform, whether, I've seen a paper data journal that the students would fill out themselves, hit some of those math standards, and they kind of tracked in a little notebook at how many words they were typing a minute or how many, minutes they spent reading that day. All those things can be tracked.
So student feedback is one of my favorite topics. And so we're going to spend the next section on domain 1.2 on student feedback. But before we go on, we do have someone who has joined us. Do you have any questions on domain 1.1 on data-driven instruction? I'm going to take that as a no, so we're going to move on. And in this domain, we're going to focus on the beginning, developing, practicing, and achieving levels of student feedback. The beginning, a student will receive feedback from a teacher in order to improve. In developing, students receive specific feedback from teachers and occasionally peers. And then practicing, students receive timely and specific feedback from peers and teachers. And then achieving, students receive timely, frequent, and specific feedback from both teachers and peers in order to improve. And so I'm going to go on to the next slide.
All right, so here, there's a lot of questions that we can ask while we're observing the classroom, but, number 3 really stands out to me is we want to know how the students are responding to that feedback, because it really needs to be quality feedback. It needs to be timely and actionable, right? If those things aren't there for the students, then it doesn't mean anything. Like if I just say good job, give them the 85, sure, they're happy they got the B, but they're not really going to grow. They're not really going to go back. And that level of what the number is that they're happy with before making corrections is different for every kid. Some kids may be happy with a 65. So no matter how many that feedback I give, it's not going to be enough to give them back. So sometimes withholding the grade, just providing the feedback and saying, hey, I'll show you your grade after you make these corrections is a lot more powerful, because the grade itself, the numerical grade or whatever grade you get, is feedback. And if you set that too low for mastery, but it's high enough for them to say, you know what, I'm good, I'll move on, then no matter how detailed that feedback is, the students aren't going to be engaged with it. So knowing your students is so important. And so understanding like, hey, how are the students going to respond to this feedback is such a vital conversation to have when you're doing blended learning and as well. And then another one that I really like is number 6, looking at the culture of the classroom. Is it okay to fail as long as we're learning from the failure, right? Like you shouldn't be afraid to fail. You should be afraid not to grow. And so that's really what we kind of want to foster in these classrooms. And so those are the ones that really stood out to me.
So when we talk about student feedback, it's important too to consider the different blended learning models that you may be observing in the classroom or in your school. And so there's the rotation model, which is it's utilized a lot in face-to-face classrooms because it's just a fantastic way to organize your classroom. You have students at different stations. Some of them are doing an online component. Another group of students may be using manipulatives or something, worksheets, things like that. And so in that, you may have the flipped classroom going on and the station rotation. So both of those are part of the rotation model. Another common method that you may see in blended learning is the flex model, in which the curriculum is provided online, and then the teacher is in the room to provide direct instruction or small group instruction or just individual tutoring, things like that. And so both of these models are what you're going to see in the classrooms. And so in both of those models, you should be observing teachers providing comments on specific strengths. So what are the students doing well? And what are the students doing correctly? And this helps the students understand what they should continue doing, and then also identifies areas to improve and provide ways to make changes. And so when we talk about real specific feedback, that's important because you want to make sure that the students are doing, growing, and building, just as Brian had said. And so when you do it this way, where you're doing something well, you're providing that compliment, you're providing some recommended specific, constructive feedback on how to make changes, and then another positive. This helps to build confidence. It also helps to establish classroom routines and procedures so that your classroom is working. And so when beginning in a developing teacher, you're often going to see that, that good job, well done, and that's just not acceptable. It doesn't help the student. And so if you're seeing this is a really good opportunity for you to work with, the teachers that you're observing, that you're seeing in the classroom, and what was good about their job, like what did they do well. And so Brian, if you don't mind moving on to the next slide, please. And so the practicing and achieving, what we should be seeing at this level is the feedback can be provided in a timely manner. And so you're going to address those misconceptions, correct that undesirable behaviors. Is it specific? Does it identify what the student is doing well? And so you should be seeing this. And what I found when teaching, particularly when my assignments and curriculum was online, it was very, very important to provide very detailed, specific feedback, because oftentimes the students were doing the online curriculum when they weren't in front of me. And so this helps the student understand what they're doing, and even reinforcing concepts that are challenging, even if they got a question right on a test. I would emphasize why it was right, so that they understood this is a really important concept. The teacher took the time to even explain it further when I got it right. And so it's timely because they're doing the assignment, the feedback is provided as it's graded, and there are a lot of tricks you can use in your learning management system. They can build a lot of the feedback right in to the questions, so that they're not always typing out this information. And so if they're using the learning management appropriately, or just fully, I guess, is really using all the tools that are available to them, they can make their life very easy, emphasize really important concepts. At the same time, it's important to emphasize that the feedback has to be actionable. So what does the student need to do to correct their mistakes? Make it very detailed, very specific. And again, when you're observing a classroom like this, you're going to see fantastic, classroom management. The students know what to do. There's routines established, and the feedback is just given consistently. Before we move on, well, thanks for joining us, Jay. It's nice to see you. And do you have any questions for us before we move out of feedback and onto the next domain? Okay, thank you.
Hey, Tamara, I just wanted to tell you though that the link that's on the flyer, you actually had to cut it. You had to cut and paste it into a Zoom. It had something on the front end. It had some, I don't know what you call that coding language, but it had some language on the front that if you just clicked it, click the link, it wouldn't let people in. That's why I was late. I was like emailing everybody going, hey, how do we get into this meeting? So I see that there's actually 4 of us here. That might be the reason.
Okay.
I had to go in, so I went into the PDF, but then on the link, there was some stuff in front of the www.zoom.gov and then the meeting ID. And as soon as I cleared that out, I dropped it in a browser search bar, and it opened right up. So you might have a few people that are trying to get in.
All right. Thanks, Jay. I'll take a look at that.
Thank you. I just checked my email. Nobody has contacted me, but I don't.
Okay. Did you get one from me? Because I emailed our whole group to say, hey, did anybody get into the link? I just sent that like a few minutes ago.
Okay.
All right, cool.
Thanks so much for letting us know. We'll make sure that is working next time.
Yeah, no, I feel bad because it's like you put all this together and then people don't get in, and
right. Yeah.
All right.
All right. So the next strand in this domain is authentic assessment. So when we start looking at what does that actually mean? So really, when I look at authentic assessment, it's more than just multiple choice, but these are the real world application assessments, right? Like some of those beyond just a standardized test, but project based and actually connecting to some of the skills that they may need to do in the workforce or in the future. And so when we look at a beginning and developing teacher, it's very unvaried, right? When they're assessing their students, it's always one type and very rote and pretty much generic, right? Those multiple choice tests, maybe an essay, things like that. As they move further in their blended learning practices and become more practiced at the practicing level and achieving, you're going to find that the assessments are more relevant to the students' lives. They're rigorous and appropriate for the learning targets. And then finally at the achieving, that's truly when the authentic comes in. And a great model of that is the project-based learning that some schools have been able to achieve.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And then just some questions for somebody doing an observation. Asking, how do the students demonstrate their learning? What are they doing? Are the students mostly answering recall questions? Are they demonstrating comprehension? Are the students asked to apply, analyze, synthesize what they're learning? And so you may not always see the student, even if it's, this is the beautiful part of blended learning. The curriculum's online, but utilizing that face-to-face classroom for the activities is so rich, because now you have all this time with your students. And so, as a science, I was a science teacher, so that this is great for a person like myself, where then the students can use the class time to do the science experiments. If they're learning math and their teacher is utilizing like a flipped model where they're receiving the curriculum at home, when they're in the classroom, they're doing all the practical application, they're practicing those skills. And so you should see the students highly engaged if the assessments are authentic.
All right, so then when we start to look at how the students are involved, or if authentic assessment is actually happening, again, at the beginning and developing stage, it's just one or two ways, right? And typically, you're just going to see it at the end of every lesson, or maybe at the end of every unit. And here's your unit exam, thanks. And then here's your feedback. And typically these are going to be, like the very low Bloom's taxonomy type questions, the knowledge and recall, very basic. And then looking at how the students are involved, they may have a little bit of engagement with the formative and summative assessments, but they don't understand how it connects to the overall learning experience. Oh, we're just doing this quiz because we take quizzes like that. Like those are the type of things that would really raise a red flag. And then the other thing is they don't have an opportunity to, have any dialogue or present or defend some of their findings and presentations. That's another thing that shows that they're not really involved in their assessment at all. And so it's probably not very authentic. So then on the flip side, what we're really looking for is those assessments that hit the higher level of Bloom's taxonomy, have them analyzing and synthesizing the information. They're able to demonstrate their learning in a lot of different ways, right? So those projects, the oral presentations, not just multiple choice. And then you're going to see them having, maybe it's just a classroom debate. Where they can start defending those things. They understand the purpose of why they're doing that activity. It's not just the activity the teacher told me to do it, and this is what I need to do to cross the stage. And then they learn to value the feedback that comes from that, not only from the teachers, but from their peers as well. And that all becomes part of the quality learning experience that we're looking for.
Okay, and domain 1.4. Choice and assessment. Basically, you're asking yourself, how do the students in the classroom demonstrate mastery? Is there one way? Is there one try, multiple tries? Or can they do the assignment more than once? And so those are the questions, that you're going to be asking in this domain. Brian, if you want to go to the next slide, please.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that you start looking at is how varied are the assessments? Is it a one-size-fits-all approach, or do the students have some sort of choice in how they're electing to demonstrate their mastery? And that you'll see that theme in a lot of these questions that are posed here. And then again, it goes back, a lot of these are tied together, which is why they're all in this single domain. That actionable and timely feedback, it has to be specific to the kid as well. Is that there to help each kid show their demonstration of mastery? Did the teacher provide it? Did they, as Tammy talked about earlier, did they provide that? Like my honors kids, I wanted to prepare them for AP. If I just said good job to those kids, they're going to leave it at that. But if I said, hey, I really liked how you explained it, it makes sense in this light, and even maybe showed them another video or something that extends the learning, they're ready for it. They're happy to see it because they got it because they did a good job. And now I've extended those learning just for those kids that are ready. And then the ones that needed another shot or other attempts, I can provide the feedback, hey, you're on the right track. there's just a few things here you need to clear up. Maybe try to, go back to this part of the module, or here's another video that explains it a different way to see if it's making sense. And you're going to see that transfer ownership through those kind of learning experiences take place from the teacher to the student.
And so when you're in the beginning and the developing parts of this domain, the mastery, the students are given a question, they answer it one time. There's no actionable feedback. Even if they received feedback, there's nothing they can do with it because they're not provided another opportunity to improve. There's no choice available for the students. So they can retake, they can't really retake. And if they are, let's say they're given 2 retakes, they just retake it, but there's no feedback provided to support the growth. So the students just, they take it once or twice, and there's just nothing to do with that. And so you would want to encourage growth in a teacher who is at the beginning of the developing choice and assessment. I think sometimes you get the pushback from teachers, well, if they can do it more than once, then they know the questions, they know the answer. Well, if it's multiple choice, that may be true, but when you're talking about those essay questions, those higher level type of questioning, then you can move on into the choice and assessment into the next phase, which is practicing and achieving. So in the practicing and achieving, you often see choices on how the students can demonstrate mastery. And I have found and observed this being very successful from the standpoint, some students really enjoy writing an essay. Others want to put together a PowerPoint presentation, video. We often use in small group, your students can give you oral answers too, because when you're working one-on-one or in small group, you can have discussions, classroom discussions to demonstrate mastery as well. And so you're not as limited as you would be in a standard test when you're using the different blended learning models and you have students doing different activities on different days. You have that opportunity to work with them. And so in addition to having choices to demonstrate mastery, they also are provided multiple opportunities to demonstrate mastery. And this is only worthwhile when the teacher is providing timely, relevant feedback so that the students have the opportunity to grow and they understand where they went wrong and they have an opportunity to correct their mistakes. When this is happening, the students take ownership, first of all, in deciding how they want to present their understanding, how they want to present how they've mastered the curriculum or the concepts or the objective. But it also it gives the student more of an experience to grow. It's very frustrating when you take a test, you get the results, you understand where you went wrong, but then you can't do anything with that new knowledge. You can't demonstrate that you mastered it. And so I really, I find that when you're working with students and you're seeing your teachers in this level, that the students are much more engaged in the class because they have those opportunities not only to select, what they're doing, but also to really understand the curriculum and then grow from each lesson to the next and build upon that prior learning and make those connections.
Yeah, and here in Clark, we had a new grade regulation that kind of implemented the idea that students are to be able to recess. It's been interesting hearing a lot of the pushback from some educators. And I think it's important to kind of understand that you hit upon it when you talked about the feedback to the kids. It's not that we're just going to let the kids pray to the testing gods, that the next time I go in, my cursor is going to click the right ones. but you can allow the students to earn the right to reassess, right? So providing them a learning opportunity after they've gotten the feedback, and it doesn't mean that you need to hold them after for tutoring. That's the power of digital learning and digital content, right? That can provide them a different learning experience, show that they're trying to learn and to master the content, and now they can reassess. So that's a really key component there, that as a teacher, you can start designing those things with the power of technology, right? And then they're not even getting the same test if you build a robust test bank. So they're getting different questions. So we're actually testing them on the skills, not necessarily them memorizing a test. And again, that goes back to the authentic assessment as well. It's my mantra that I always said is it's easy to cheat on a test. Kids will find a way. Doesn't matter what time of year it is or what period you taught. Kids are going to find a way to cheat, but it's really hard to cheat a conversation. I can know in 30 seconds whether a kid really gets a concept just as well as I can tell from a 30-question multiple choice test. Those conversations are a true authentic assessment that you can have with the kids.
So I think it's important before we go on, Brian, one of the things we forgot to mention, which is the whole point, is we do have the NEPF alignment at the bottom of each of the slides. And so if we just took a look at this particular slide, and we looked at NEPF, 1.4, 2.2, 3.2, and 3.4, you basically, when we're talking about 1.4, teacher provides all students opportunities to build on, challenge initial understandings. You can see how this completely aligns with the NEPF in that manner, because the teacher is providing those opportunities to challenge and build upon understanding as you're implementing or using a mastery style of learning or teaching, however you want to look at that. And when you look at standard 2.2, tasks place appropriate demands on each student. And so as the teacher in the classroom, another wonderful component of a learning management system is you can actually assign different assignments to different students. So there are ways to group if you wanted to go about it in that manner. The other way that this can be done is as a teacher is grading, she knows or he knows the students in the class that have IEPs or maybe, are English learners and on different plans. And so students can't see each other's work in a learning management system. So you can actually, be more personalized once again and make sure that those tasks do meet those students. And through feedback, the way that a teacher provides feedback, the expectation for one student can be different for another student. And that is all very confidential within between the teacher and the student. And then 3.2 and 3.4, just to finish the alignment on this one, is 3.2 is teacher provides opportunities for all students to create and interpret multiple representations. And so by providing choices, you're meeting this standard. And then 3.4 is the teacher structures the classroom environment to enable collaboration, participation, and a positive experience for all students. And so again, when you're in the classroom, a blended classroom, it is very different than doing a classroom observation that is not a blended learning model. And so the purpose of this series that Brian and I are putting together is to really help you see the alignment between the NEPF and how to take the NEPF and use it in a blended learning classroom, because it's not always as straightforward. And there are areas where I know I've done observations where I'm like, just don't know if I'm seeing them build connections. Like where are they incorporating the prior learning? Where is this taking place? And so by going through this series with us, we're going to help with that alignment between the NEPF and the classroom observations for blended classrooms. I hope that makes sense. Do you, Jay or Vince, have any questions for us on anything we presented on the NEPF alignment?
I really like the phrase actionable feedback and those questions you guys provided for in the observation to ask students. Just some feedback for you guys. And then the domains that you guys are talking about, where do those come from? Like domain 1.4?
So Brian, if you want to bring us back to, I think you have it on
Yeah.
slide 1.
Yeah, way up to slide 1. So when we start talking about how we're looking at blended learning, what it is, there's 5 domains, and in each side of those domains, there's several strands. And so we talked about 4 strands of the assessment and data domain today. And then in future ones, we'll talk about instructional rigor, classroom culture, student agency, and equity, and how those are related to a blended learning classroom and the NEPF.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Sure. What Brian and I have decided to do is we want to break each domain into a different webinar so that because so many people, there's just so many people unable to attend this year due to school activities or back in session, things like that. So the next month we will look at instructional rigor, and then if you cannot attend live, you will be able to watch the recording on the prior lesson, or if you wanted to go back and view something or share it with coworkers, things like that.
Do these touch on the professional standards too, or just the instructional?
So we have a document that has some professional standards, but most of this is focused on the instructional standards, because this would be like classroom type observations. Here in the chat, there's a link to the overall document that we're working off of that breaks down each of the 5 domains and then the strands in each of them.
But we can, if that's something that you feel would be helpful. We hadn't really talked about it because the professional standards are so much the same, whether you're in a blended school or in a brick and mortar. But it doesn't mean that we can't do that.
No, I don't think there's a need. I was just curious.
No, appreciate that. We appreciate the feedback, and definitely for letting us know that the links don't work that well from the PDF. So we will have to either produce our flyer in Word, or I don't know, we'll have to take a look at that.
Yeah, when I was clicking on it, it would sometimes open Zoom, but then said the meeting was invalid.
Okay.
And then sometimes it just wouldn't go to Zoom at all.
It looked like the HTTP was copied in twice. So like when I put in the URL, the program that I make the flyer in added HTTP in front of HTTP, and that's what was causing the error.
All right. Well, we will fix that for next time.
Absolutely.
So I was just wondering, so we are actually at 7 schools in Northern Nevada are doing authentic grading practices. So we're talking about feedback. It was super interesting to hear, Brian, you mentioned like some of the things like you getting some pushback on, hey, we can turn assignments in at different times. And because one of the things about authentic grading is the timeline isn't as important as whether or not the kid shows mastery. So it's super interesting here that you're all talking about the blended learning where you're doing online and in school, but we're talking about the same thing in person as well, because the assessments that we're using, those paper, pencil, bubble in, multiple choice, school city, rip through the Scantron device, like that is not doing anything for our kids. And we're getting the same blowback from people inside the school that are going, no, we want to stick with traditional types of assessment, but the feedback is not, it's not helpful. Like we're not basing it on standards. You got a 47 out of 100. but they can't tell me, well, I missed this, and, you need to focus on this. So that was really interesting. And I know I just see at the bottom of this slide that you have up that it's Dallas Independent School District. And I just wanted to, I love all the other stuff. The student agency, you should have seen the tomatoes coming out of the bullpen at me when I said, yeah, your kids should be helping you design the assessments, right? They were like, what? But the one thing that always gets me is we talk about instructional rigor. I mean, if we're going back to Marzano and Dufour and all that, it was always rigor and relevance. Somewhere we just chopped off relevance. It was like a appendage we didn't need. And it's the most important one. So we've been kind of preaching that too. And I would say from our state, we've been preaching it from the north. Look, we get the end of course exams and we get that stuff, but how's that relevant? What data, how are we using the data? I don't know, if anybody's involved in math or anything like that. We're wondering where are the EOC test scores? Why don't we get them until the November after the year the kids are gone? So it's just not relevant. So that was my thing. And I'm glad you're talking about this because it was awesome to hear the blended people talking about the same thing that the in-person people are talking about. And maybe there's a better hybrid for all our schools to be able to do a little bit of both, the outside and the inside. So I appreciate you guys. That was cool. Sorry I was late.
Jay, I can't think what it was called, but I had when I used to be in the classroom, and this was a long time ago, I moved to online education years ago, but there is a way to take, even if they're using Scantrons, to take all of that information and right after the test was done, I could project from my computer onto the wall, what the kids got wrong, what was right. And it was all just by numbers. So they didn't know who, but they knew 5 people missed this question. And so it gave me an opportunity to reteach the students right away. And so I don't know if I honestly cannot remember what I was using, but I
using ZipGrade.
What was it?
ZipGrade, because we use ZipGrade, and that
maybe
it does that exactly that. But I think where we get into and again, you guys brought this up, the pushback that comes with no, we gave the test on this day. This is their final summative assessment. And that's what we're running into, that sort of traditional mentality about, no, they have to be able to perform on that test right then. And if they don't, then we don't go back. Get that, at the end of the semester. It's funny. I mean, I see you smile, Brian. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. My thing that I always say back is, all right, if your boss treated you like that and came to you and said, hey, no, we did payday yesterday and you weren't here, you didn't get paid, you would be furious. That's not really how the world works, right? So let's what's more important? The kid on Tuesday showed you that they know it, or the kid just shows you they know it, right? That's really, what are you here for?
Yeah, I love your comment that you said, I can tell more by a 30-second conversation than I can from the test that the sort of standardized test. I totally believe that. We should be trusting our classroom teachers to be able to have and it's great relationship building, right? You got to take the time to know the kid. So that was really cool. When you said 30 seconds, I'm like, yep, that makes sense to me. We just got to get the state to think oh, well, Brian's professional opinion means something. So if he says this kid's proficient, then the kid should be proficient instead of waiting for a test, right?
I wouldn't hold out hope for that. That might be.
We're fighting it, man. It's crazy. The principals up here, the high school principals are just we're baffled at why we pulled all the power away from the teachers and put it in these little sort of pocket tests when we could do project-based learning. And everybody likes to come and see the projects. Everybody shows up on project day, but nobody shows up on Scantron test day. Weird. So I'm excited to hear that you guys are doing that. It's really cool. So thanks for fighting the fight. I appreciate it.
Well, absolutely. And thank you for joining us. And then our next meeting is, I don't remember. I shouldn't have brought that up without knowing first, should I? Do you have a calendar in front of you, Brian?
Nope, I'm scrambling now too.
I'm opening the calendar. I'll be there in a second. I think we moved it up because of the holidays, but it's on a Tuesday. It must be the 14th. Yep. Tuesday,
Yep.
December 14th.
Yep, and we'll be talking about instructional rigor in the 4 strands that go with that.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you guys.
Take care.